This short video will introduce you to Modern Language Association style guidelines when writing a works cited page. Each discipline has its own citation style. There's the APA style for the social sciences, the CSE style for biology, ecology, and medicine, and the Chicago style for art, history, music, and theater. But we'll be focusing on MLA style guidelines because you'll be writing for the English language and literature courses. It's also used for foreign languages, philosophy, and other areas in the humanities. Knowing how to use a citation style is essential, first and foremost for establishing your credibility as a researcher and a writer. Incorrect citation of sources indicates your incompetence as both within your discipline. You also provide a consistent method when you cite correctly for your readers so that they can locate your sources, making it easier to be persuaded by your ideas. And lastly, you avoid plagiarism when you know how to cite correctly. Plagiarism is an indicator of dishonesty as well as incompetence. So let's begin with the works cited page. It's the page we want to start with because it's the page that you're going to be pointing your reader to throughout your entire essay. In fact, the whole point of Modern Language Association style is to direct your reader to your works cited page, which lists the sources of all the information that you cite in your essay. Since you'll be continually pointing your reader to this page as you write your essay, it's good to have the page written beforehand. So we're going to begin with the works cited page. MLA Style Guidelines, edition 9, lists 9 elements that are common to most works, author, and so on. And it lists these elements in this order, and you're going to need to follow this order when listing those same elements of your sources. So let's look at an example of how this works. So we have an author, Northrop Frye. We place the last name of the author first, followed by a comma, then the first name and a period. The title of the source is the title of his essay, Don't You Think It's Time to Start Thinking? We put that in quotation marks. Because the title includes a question mark, we include that instead of the period that would normally follow the title of an essay. We found this in the Mercury Reader, the text for our class. So this is italicized, followed by a comma. Other contributors include the editors of a text. Our text does have editors. In fact, we have more than 2 editors, and so we have to include the abbreviation et al. When a source has 3 or more contributors in the same role, and by the way, this same rule applies to authors. When you have 3 or more authors, you do the same thing. You list the name of the first, and then you follow it with the abbreviation et al. We don't have a version or a number, so we skip to our 7th element, which is the publisher, Pearson. It's okay to skip an element if it doesn't exist. When we don't have a version of a text, we simply skip it. We don't have a number, we skip it. After the publisher, we list the publication date. Our text was published in 2016, and the location, that is the page numbers where we find that essay, beginning on page 52 and concluding on page 54. We put the entire page range for the essay. Even if we quote from only, say, page 53, we're still going to list pages 52 through 54. So we put it all together and it looks something like this, with a hanging indent. A hanging indent is when the first line of the entry appears at the margin on the left, but all the other lines for that entry are indented. Our first element, followed by our second, our third, and our fourth. Remember, we skipped elements 5 and 6, so then we go to elements 7, 8, and then 9. And this is what a works cited entry will look like. We list our sources in alphabetical order. I've circled the words the Bible here. That's because it's not alphabetized by the word the. If it were, it would appear much further down on our works cited list. Instead, we alphabetize it by the word Bible. Well, that's because we ignore the words the, a, and an when we're alphabetizing sources. We don't pay attention to those determiners. So because I'm ignoring the word the, I'm going to go right to the next word, which is Bible, and I'm going to alphabetize this under BI for Bible, following BE for Beowulf. Also notice that when I have 2 works by the same author, as we have down here at the bottom by Shakespeare, the second time we list the author, we don't put the author's name. Instead, in place of the author's name, we type in 3 hyphens, as we've done here. Notice, though, I have still included his sources in alphabetical order. So The Merchant of Venice appears before much ado about nothing. That's because, again, we ignore the word the, and we look at the word merchant, and merchant comes before much. ME appears before MU alphabetically. Okay, we're going to double space throughout. Notice that there are no extra spaces between the words works cited, which are centered at the top of your page, and the first entry. We don't put any extra spaces there. We don't bold or increase the font size of the words works cited. Everything's in the same font size. Everything's listed alphabetically, and everything is double spaced throughout with no extra spaces. We use 1-inch margins around our page, and we use these hanging indents. Again, as a reminder, that means that the first line of each entry appears at the left margin, but all other lines for each entry are indented, as you can see here. Okay, and you want to list your URLs. The URLs are required unless your instructor tells you not to include them. And lastly, remember to put a page break before your works cited page. It needs to be on its own page, not halfway down the last page of your written essay. Okay, so sometimes the author is a corporation or an organization, as we see here, the National Endowment for the Arts. Obviously, this is not a person, but it is the author of Reading at Risk, a survey of literary reading in America. Also, sometimes the title of the source is the first element listed. Sometimes television shows or films are listed without, obviously, an author. So here we have the one where everybody finds out, an episode from Friends. There's no author. So, of course, we just list the source, the title of the show first. All right, sometimes we need a second container. Sometimes our source flows over into another container because we are finding the source in a library database, which will be the case for most of you. So let's pick an author, Anne Goldman. The title of her article is Questions of Transport, Reading Primo Levi, Reading Dante. We found it in the Georgia Review, a periodical. We didn't have any contributors, we didn't have any versions, so we skipped down to the volume and number of the periodical, volume 64, number 1. Again, no publishers, so we go down to the date, 2010, and it appears on pages 69 through 88. The problem is we didn't pick this up as a hard copy magazine from some library shelf or some newsstand somewhere. No, we found it in a database. So we have to say where this was all found, and so we need a second container. So we found it in JSTOR, right? And then we're going to skip these other elements and go down to the location, which is the URL. So this is what we have here. We have one container which lists the actual source, and then we flow over to a second container listing the database where we found that source. So again, we're going to put all these together. This time I'm going to put an extra space between the second and the third line, just so I can show you how these are put in the correct order. For the first container, again in sequential order, 1, 2, 3, we skip elements 4 and 5 because they don't exist. 6, we skip elements 7, 8, and 9. That's from our first container. Then we go to our second container, element 3 and element 9. So this is how this would appear in your works cited page using both containers because you're citing a source from a database. When you're looking at databases, we need to distinguish between URLs and DOIs. The location of an online work is commonly indicated by its URL or web address. Your instructor may prefer that you not include them, but MLA recommends the inclusion of URLs in the works cited list. When giving a URL, you can usually omit the HTTP or the HTTPS. And so, for example, here's a source listed from JSTOR, and we do not list the HTTP before the www.jstor in its location. However, we do include the HTTPS with DOIs. A DOI is a digital object identifier. It's permanently assigned to a source by the publisher. DOIs are more reliable than URLs because DOIs remain attached to their sources even if the URL changes. Think of it as a kind of ISBN number for online sources. When one exists, a DOI is always preferred over a URL for a works cited entry. So here we have the DOI, and notice that for the DOI, we in fact do use an HTTPS before it. Lastly, let's talk about an optional element, date accessed. The date you access electronic material is not required because many electronic academic resources, such as those you find in the library's databases, are stable. For example, articles available in JSTOR are unlikely to change from one day to the next in its location. However, these databases, in particular JSTOR, have still been adding this optional element to their citation information. And so here we have an example here, an entry by Rex Martin, and we have an accessed date added to it. This is provided by JSTOR when you click on its Cite button, but we don't need it. It's simply not required. However, there are some online sources that can and do change. Web pages can be updated or taken down, blog posts can be modified or deleted, and some scholarly resources can move or have multiple versions, particularly those that are hosted by universities on their web pages. So there's a good reason to use this optional element for these instances. Follow the instructions that your professors give you about including this and any other optional MLA elements in your works cited entries. Well, that concludes our short instructional video on using MLA style guidelines to create a works cited page.